Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over this series and the last, we've been talking to human rights academics and practitioners about research, impact, and advocacy in the struggle for human rights. I'm Todd Landman. In today's special episode of the Rights Track, we are asking what are the human rights implications of a Trump presidency? On the day of the inauguration of the 45th President of the United States, which is followed the next day by the Women's March in Washington, D.C., and other major cities in the U.S., as well as around the world, we're focusing first on women's rights, but then using this occasion to look at how this movement of women and the demands they are articulating relate to other rights issues in the era of Donald Trump. My guest is Monica Casper, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Inclusion in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Arizona. She's a professor of sociology who works on gender, bodies, health, disability, and trauma, with a particular focus on reproductive health and politics. She's also managing editor of The Feminist Wire, an online blog and resource focusing on justice and equality from a feminist perspective. So welcome, Monica. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of The Rights Track. So you're joining us from Arizona, where I'm sure the weather is probably more favorable than here in the UK. But this is a bit of a stormy week in politics in the United States and in the world, I might add. So we have an inauguration of one of the most unpopular president-elects in the history of the United States. I think the polls are showing about 37% support for Donald Trump. And the day after the inauguration, an extraordinary social movement is having a march on Washington. It's the Women's March. It's been organized by a group of young women, and the network that supports it has grown very quickly since the election in November. And the marches they're organizing are not only in Washington, D.C., but what they call sister marches across the United States. There are over several hundred, I believe, that are being organized. And I know that there are marches being organized in Washington, D.C., as well as cities outside the U.S. and Oceania and other parts of the world. So my first question for you, Monica, really is about focusing on human rights, women's rights as human rights in the era of Donald Trump. We've watched the campaign, we've seen the language and the discourse around women. So I want you just to reflect briefly on what do you think are the key issues that women's groups need to think about after the inauguration?
So a couple of things. You mentioned that we're facing the inauguration, but we're also facing in Arizona HB2120, which is legislation that wants to prohibit the teaching of social justice in schools and universities. So at the very local level here, all the way out to the global level, I think we're going to be facing a number of challenges with this administration. I'm using the term minority president, which speaks to his unpopularity here and elsewhere. And let's just go through some of the issues that we're looking at. Let's talk about healthcare, for example. Repealing Obamacare, or the ACA, is a priority for the Republicans and certainly for the Trump administration. And that is very bad for women on many fronts. It's bad in terms of reproductive health care. It's bad in terms of women being able to care for their families. And it's bad for women's ability to reproduce, which is one of my particular interests. Refunding of health care and taking away Obamacare is cutting off funding for the Child Health Insurance Program, CHIP. It's also going to challenge women's ability to get contraceptive coverage and maternity care provision, which is particularly concerning given that the U.S. has elevated rates of maternal mortality, particularly among women of color. And then we have the issues that come with health insurance and women's ability to care for their families. So when we hear defund Planned Parenthood and do away with the ACA or Obamacare, we're talking about health care for, in the case of Planned Parenthood, 5 million people, mostly preventative health care. So that's a large concern. If we're talking about maternal mortality in the United States, Black women die at a rate of 4 times that of white women. So maternal mortality will go up, infant mortality will go up, women's health will be disproportionately impacted by these policies. We could also talk about workplace issues under a Trump administration.
Could we just stop you on the health issue? I mean, there's a lot going on there. It's a multi-pronged set of issues and a bit of intersection between gender and race and poverty and marginalization, et cetera. But also, just so people understand, access to contraception suddenly becomes under question. So under the ACA, women do have access to contraception, which would be funded by ACA. Is that correct?
That's correct. And about 80% of Planned Parenthood services are focused on preventing unintended pregnancy. So I mean, I think people worry that Planned Parenthood is the abortion provider, and that's a very tiny percentage of the overall services. So we're really looking at policies that will actually lead to more unintended pregnancies.
That's a good clarification. But also, so the big promise around repealing the ACA is that some replacement will be put into place. But of course, there's a lag between repealing one policy and developing a new one. And we haven't really seen any evidence of a replacement plan being developed that could be brought into effect quick enough for the 5 million people you're talking about, or roughly the 20 million that have just been able to access healthcare. So there's a real significant lag between this repeal and bringing anything new to the fore. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. So there's a lag, and there's actually nothing on the table yet. So not only is there no replacement, there's not a lot of conversation about replacement. So the discourse has really been focused on doing away with Obamacare and not thinking about what might come in its place, other than, for example, privately funded insurance, which is not everyone's going to have access to.
Okay, so let's move from healthcare then. Your second point was around workplace, so talk us through that.
Well, sure. Let's think about Trump in relation to his position in corporate America. He's not interested in equal opportunity or equal pay for women. He has quite a record in this regard in terms of his statements about what women can expect out of the economy and out of their work. I don't think he's going to be an administration that's friendly to any kind of labor law enforcement issues. He has spoken about workplace harassment in actually rather disparaging terms, that women who are harassed in the workplace are, of course, probably doing something wrong in his view. So I don't think that women, particularly women in lower or pink collar professions or non-management positions who, are on a paycheck to paycheck basis, are going to be benefited from this administration. And the irony, of course, is it's a campaign that ran on the economy, but no policies are in place yet that will actually benefit women, particularly single mothers, particularly women of color who are marginalized in certain kinds of occupations in the United States, right, that make them particularly vulnerable to workplace inequalities.
So what sort of occupations are you talking about?
Well, I'm thinking about manufacturing. I mean, we talk about the white working class here and that population being responsible for Trump, but the working class has not been fully white for a very long time. It really never has been fully white. So if we think about who's doing the work of cleaning and caretaking and building and putting together, we're talking mostly about women of color.
Yeah, right. Quite precarious as well. So this paycheck to paycheck, there's a lot of uncertainty there. And yet this was a campaign that was run on bringing jobs back to America, and particularly manufacturing jobs. So the trade protectionism, the tariffs and things that are envisaged, and the carrier story, the Sprint story, these sort of keeping jobs in America. Those sorts of jobs, do they come with minimum wage guarantees? Do they come with security of contract? And, do they come with health benefits? Those are really big questions that a lot of the working class will be asking, right?
Well, I think that's right. And we've seen, over the last several decades, the weakening of the labor movement in the United States. And even the Democratic Party was meant to be the party for working people, and they've fallen down on that job as well. So, we're looking at a 4 to 8 year period where there will be real challenges to people's ability to organize and fight for just a minimum wage, much less affordable childcare, healthcare, paid family leave, healthy workplaces, all of the things that make work life sustainable.
What about the larger cultural issues? So quite apart from the concrete issues of access to healthcare, workplace security, gender relations within the workplace, etc., what about some of the broader discourses and cultural things that might be due to change after the inauguration, given everything we learned in the campaign?
Yeah, well, I think Trump's election has given people permission to speak as openly as possible about race and gender in ways that are very negative. I mean, I hear all the time from people about conversations they're overhearing or they're having or they're being forced to respond to from a very emboldened sort of white nationalist movement. And just everyday people whose perhaps previously hidden racism and sexism is now very firmly on the table. So we have a man who's about to become president who has, I call on Facebook sexual predator in chief. I mean, somebody who has just a long list of charges against him and allegations against him for his treatment of women, who now is setting the tone for the rest of this country.
Sure. And we heard during the campaign, sort of 12 celebrated cases of women coming forward and articulating allegations of sexual misconduct of various kinds against him. And yet he plans on suing them in return. Has that died away, or is he still promising to do that once becoming president?
That I don't know. I don't know if he's still planning to sue them or not. What it does mean is that it's already notoriously difficult for women to come forward for all kinds of reasons. And now those women who have come forward and any other woman after that sees the result of coming forward, which is being maligned by the person they're accusing and actually having him elevated to a position of power. So this is what we see. You know, Todd, I have two daughters, right? They're 15 and 12. I teach undergraduates. This is culturally the message that we're sending to these young women and men. And it's very frightening. I mean, my kids are pretty worried about the kind of world that they're about to inherit.
Yeah, there's a strong line through feminist literature about unseen power relations and power relations more generally, and gender power relations and the intersection between gender and power, etc. And here we have a stark example of power, someone being anointed with tremendous power. Some argue one of the most powerful positions in politics in the world. And yet there seems to be no institutional fix to curb that power, or to at least the ability to stop that power being assumed by that person. And yet, with all the things we learn with respect to women, that's going to happen. And I think that message being sent to people like your kids and the students that we teach it's like a profound disruption, a cultural disruption, if you will, at this moment in time.
I think that's right. And here in Arizona, where we have a fairly significant population, not just of women students, but of undocumented students across our universities, the other message that's coming through, of course, is a very xenophobic one that, we don't welcome immigrants. Build the wall, pay for the wall. That entire language is permeating our community. Our students are terrified. I mean, we've had students in tears, not necessarily worried that they will be deported, but that their families will be deported, that they will not be able to finish their educations. And that kind of chilling effect means that, our communities feel embattled, even in progressive cities like Tucson, where we're trying to make a difference.
So let's turn a little bit to the inauguration itself. I mean, it's going to be a little bit of a strange affair, because typically it's been celebrated with past presidents, members of Congress, various celebrities, etc. And we know the story about the various celebrities not coming. There's a swearing-in ceremony. There's usually swearing in with your hand on the Bible to protect the Constitution. All those sorts of things will probably go forward. So there's the standard ceremony. We understand some Democrats are boycotting the inauguration. Wonder what your views were on all of that.
Yeah, I'd be happy if all of them boycotted the inauguration. I think that any kind of legitimacy attached to this administration is a problem. It's the most hostile administration to human flourishing that I've ever seen, and that perhaps we've ever seen here. And I worry that folks like Hillary Clinton, who's going to show up at this inauguration, that to me feels like a bit of a betrayal, even though there is precedent, right, for the opposing candidate to show up. There's just something about this particular administration which is not necessarily ideological. I mean, I've had presidents with whom I've disagreed ideologically before. I mean, George Bush was one of them, but there's something about Trump's dismissal of the institution itself, of the power of the presidency, of basic human decency, that is deeply, deeply offensive to people, certainly on the left, and it should be as offensive to people on the right. And so any celebration of this administration and any normalizing through our processes and institutions and media coverage is a problem.
So that's a really strong claim that goes beyond politics in a way, because we know the Electoral College has produced the result it produced. We even know that count was quite a close one, 80,000 votes across several highly contested states. And we also know that Hillary Clinton won more than 2.5 million popular votes. And people have been talking about that she'd actually defeated Barack Obama in 2008 by the popular vote as well. And no one really jumped up and down about that. But there's a certain character to this particular outcome that goes beyond politics, I think you're saying, that really hits at a personal cultural level that we haven't yet seen in American politics. And that's what makes this quite an exceptional event this Friday.
I think that's right. And I think that is why we're seeing not just the marches on Saturday, but events like our teach-in that we're hosting on Friday, so that we have events happening the day of the inauguration that are not necessarily anti-Trump events, but there's certainly events that are meant to show a solidarity with a certain vision of a democratic America that Trump does not represent. And at least for me, from where I'm located in all kinds of ways, thinking of this as any kind of legitimate presidency is the first step towards something that feels suspiciously like a kind of fascism.
Interesting. So the other person who raised the legitimacy question, of course, was John Lewis over the weekend, and celebrated civil rights leader in anticipation of Martin Luther King Day, etc., had uttered some words about legitimacy of the president. And Trump hit back, as he does on Twitter, etc., and there's been a kind of backlash against the backlash, etc. So there is this real question about legitimacy that's out there and authenticity, etc., that I think will rumble forward after the inauguration. So I wonder, based on that general fear and worry about questions of authenticity, legitimacy, democratic legitimacy, etc., what's the goal and the main ambition of the Women's March on Saturday? Is it a celebration of our democratic values? Is it a celebration of our ability for free speech, assembly, association, etc.? How far do you think they're going to take the argument, and what's the real ambition of this march on Saturday?
Sure. So yes and yes to those two questions. Let me say one thing. I mean, we have some folks here, using the popular slogan, "Not my president," right? It's become a hashtag. And I don't actually like that hashtag because it makes our position in relation to the presidency very individualized. So we can all hashtag "not my president," but that doesn't actually lead to any kind of collective action. So the nice thing about the marches, and I can't speak to the organizers because I'm not one of them for the DC March or even the local march here. I'm organizing a teach-in on Friday. I think it is a celebration of unity, but it's definitely a moment to stand up and resist what many of us feel is an illegitimate presidency, and one that is particularly harmful to women. We have had presidents before who have been sexist. This is no surprise to anybody. But to have somebody like Donald Trump, who so embodies a kind of white nationalist misogyny that is going to challenge women's lives on so many fronts, it just feels horrible. And I think that this is what we're seeing in terms of this response on Facebook and the marches, and a chance to go and have a show of strength in a long line of marches that go past, centuries, to show a kind of civil discontent with what's happening. And it is also about our right to free speech and our right to assemble. I mean, these are all constitutionally guaranteed rights. And this is also a presidency that wants to threaten many aspects of the Constitution. So I think it's multi-layered, but not just a celebration, right? I mean, it's a moment to stand up and say, "Hey, Trump, we're here and we're watching."
That's interesting. And so I know there was a march by the suffragettes, I believe, in 1918. That was actually a long march that wasn't just in Washington, but to Washington. And women on horseback marching on Washington. So there are precedents for this. There is a strong tradition of protest, civil disobedience, and social movements in America. Not just the civil rights movement, but the women's movement, second wave feminism, the gay rights movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy movement. We've had a series of movements and cycles of protest here. And I'm curious if you think maybe this Women's March will lead to a new cycle of mobilization. And one of the defining features of successful social mobilization, of course, is that you interpolate groups outside your primary focus of interest. So it's not just about women's rights, it's about other rights, it's about other articulated demands that others might feel welcome to join. And I wonder, what's the male participation in the march on Saturday? What are other groups joining? Is it all just about gender identification, or are there broader messages there?
I think for the DC March, there were some fits and starts with that march in terms of challenges to the intersectionality of the march, to whether it was diverse enough. There are questions about who gets to organize these sorts of events and who gets to participate. Yeah. So we've seen, some not surprising, not splits necessarily, but just questions raised about who's really represented. And I think that the mainstream kind of DC marchers have addressed that to some degree. I wouldn't say they fully addressed it, but we have another maybe 370 to 400 marches happening all over the country. And each of those is going to have, I think, the local flavor of the community that they're in. I posted something the other day about a Portland march where the women of color had pulled out because they were very frustrated with the answers that the white women who organized the march were giving them about the kinds of issues that they care about, which are women's issues, but they're also employment, safety, health, all kinds of things that cut far beyond simply women's rights, that include all of those things, right? So, here in Tucson, our organizing committee is quite diverse, and it's impossible for us, I think, to organize something here without an attention to the issues of immigration and race, because we sit right at the U.S.-Mexico border. So so my sense is that, there's a national march that will get all the coverage. There will be local marches that have particular flavor. Each of those will have different aims and goals, with an overarching sense of trying to show strength in the face of this new administration that is so dangerous.
So if we turn from the national to the international, I was doing an interview today with a radio station, and the person interviewing me said, well, there are going to be some marches here in Europe, and in particular in the UK, and they're billing themselves more as anti-Trump marches. And she asked me, she said, what impact could we possibly have on American politics from here? So is this just a show of solidarity? Do you think it's a good thing that there will be marches in Europe and the UK on the same day as the Women's March?
I do think it's a good thing. And, there are some folks who argue that marching is silly, that it's not going to lead to anything. But I do think a show of strength, a visible show of strength internationally, is important. It's a message to the Trump administration. It's also a message to all of the Republicans who initially were hesitant about Trump and who now are lining up behind him, sort of in lockstep. I think they need to know that we're watching and that there are many, many things that we can't allow in our democratic society.
And that's the point. There's this role for vigilance, there's a role for monitoring, there's a role for accountability. And there's been a lot of discussions about the press conference in New York that Trump had, and that the press are kind of feeding into his game. They're kind of looking for ratings and headlines, etc., and they'll publish anything. And he didn't have to pay for much media coverage because he just kept saying outlandish things. But there's a more serious role for the journalists. There's a role for really in-depth analysis, really good corroborative evidence of stories, verification of things that are happening, and holding to account people who are in positions of power. And I think that more methodical, slow-going, if you will, work around the journalistic side is so very important and a pillar of democratic society and free society across the piece that it's welcome that we see this. And democratic societies thrive on the quote-unquote loyal opposition, the opposition that's being given voice. You have a right to challenge incumbents, and that's a fundamental feature of liberal democracy across the world.
It is, absolutely. And we need to be able to talk to each other. And I think that, we live in an age of social media. Here we are Skyping across two countries, right? But we also need to convene together. We need to see each other face to face. We need to have conversations in our communities. And I think that, the Black Lives Matter movement has done this particularly well. I mean, there are national leaders, but there are also local leaders. There are groups across numerous cities, including in Canada and outside the United States, other countries outside the U.S. And so they have, national phone calls to touch base with each other. But the local organizations, move to their own pace sometimes. And I think that that's what we might see following this march. I don't know that we can speak of a women's movement per se anymore. I think there are so many different kinds of movements. I've been thinking about this in relation to women's health. I don't think we have a women's health movement anymore in the same way that we might have in the 60s and 70s. So what do we have instead, right? Do we have a series of actions and institutional challenges, people on the ground, people in positions of power? So it does look incremental sometimes, but it has to look consistent, and we have to be able to learn from each other across these different communities.
There was a great book that a colleague of mine wrote called Inviting Women's Rebellion. It really was about second-wave feminism and the Kennedy presidency, which, of course, founded the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women in American Society. And this was actually an invitation by the president to look at the condition of women and gender relations more generally. And it did trigger lots of mobilization, etc. And her story is one of partial success, but also partial failure, that the interaction between Congress, protests, media coverage, etc., was a kind of three-way relationship. But in the end, the Equal Rights Amendment did not garner enough votes in Congress and across the states to be successful. And that was a kind of, in many ways, a focus movement. But you're really talking about quite a lot of diversity in the movement today. And it isn't about changing legislation, but it's about that presence and about articulating views about objection to eroding things that have been achieved in the last 30 years.
That's right. And I think, when I say the importance of talking to each other, I mean across movements as well, right? So the crucial, just the absolute necessity of being intersectional, right? Way that we do our work, so that it isn't just white women, it's all women at the table, and not just at the table, but being leaders in the movement. So we have to listen to our sisters, we have to listen to each other, we have to talk to workers' rights, we have to talk to the environmental justice people, and that makes us stronger. And we won't always agree, absolutely. We see that all the time, but that's part of the process. And then I think the other piece, and this comes from being a teacher and a mom, is that I think we owe it to the next generations to do something. right?
Yeah.
And to be visible in that doing. And it might be, Mason and I my oldest had a conversation the other day because we had initially planned to head to DC, and I had even booked tickets, and then I backed off a little bit. I was worried initially about whether it would be intersectional enough, and really wanted to do something either through the Feminist Wire or in my local community. And Mason said, well, Mom, why aren't we going to DC? That's where all the action is. Tucson's just kind of like, Tucson, And I said, well, that's true. I said, but we have multiple events in Tucson, and this is where we live. I mean, this is our community. So if we can make a difference here, whatever that looks like, right, to extend the conversation, to generate some dialogue about what's happening, to provide a space for you and some of your friends who feel that the schools at the moment are not providing that space, then that's our obligation.
And I like that reference to motherhood and being a mom, because other movements against government, one that comes to mind is the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo in Argentina. And so these were women who were mothers, who had lost husbands, who had lost fathers, who had lost sons, and had lost brothers to the Argentine regime. And yet there was something about being mothers and actually identifying as mothers in that moment that made them in some sense safe to protest and untouchable. And I think there is a particular subject position that women can assume, or do assume, that in protest is very, very powerful politically. And so I guess my final question for you is this going to be a peaceful march in Washington? Because America's famous for its political violence as well. And I'm curious about what would be the response. Are there going to be counter movements, civil society groups that don't agree with the women's movement, and or obviously security forces will have to be there to keep security in Washington, etc. But generally the protests in Washington have been quite peaceful. Is there a specter of violence on the horizon, or is this just going to be a democratic moment?
I hope it's a democratic moment. Certainly the organizers want a peaceful march. I do have some concerns. One is that a Trump presidency gives permission to the NRA and to people who are perfectly comfortable being armed. It gives permission to white nationalists. So if we have those folks coming into DC at the same time that we have, millions of women and other supporters coming into DC, then there is the potential for violence. So I worry about it. I mean, I'm not a fortune teller, so I can't really tell what's going to happen. We're intending for our march to be peaceful as well. We have Tucson PD and UAPD planning to patrol lightly. People have the right to show up and disagree with us. I mean, I don't think anybody would suggest otherwise. I mean, we have some folks on campus who preach quite regularly, and I suspect that one of our preachers will be at our event, and that's fine. He has the right to be there. It's when we cross the line into threatening people or becoming violent that we get worried. So I'm going to try to be optimistic about the march in Washington and everywhere else, and just hope that people are safe.
Well, I'm hoping to be optimistic in general, because the American system is built around the sense of checks and balances. The Republican Party does control the three branches of government at the moment, potentially the Supreme Court. It's not a done deal in that sense. But there's a midterm election in 2 years' time, so the ebb and flow of politics is one that does move quite interestingly in the American system. So there are checks and balances, and there are people who say, actually, you can't do that, or that's going too far, etc. So I have a glimmer of hope that some of those mechanisms remain in place. So I just wanted to thank you so much at very short notice joining us here on the Rights Track. We're all kind of watching with bated breath in many ways this week, and certainly with the inauguration, the Women's March, and see how those politics play out. But I think what you've given us is an amazing window into the complexity of what's happening in U.S. politics, the complexity of what's happening on Saturday, and kind of the unresolved nature of these politics, that this is just a really interesting moment. The juxtaposition of the inauguration and the Women's March across 2 days gives the world a really interesting view on the complexity of American society, and hopefully the complexity of the American psyche and politics. There are no easy answers to what we're going to witness, but there are certainly interesting pathways forward. So it just leaves me to thank you very, very much for joining us here on the Rights Track today.
Thank you so much, Todd. Happy to be here.
This episode of The Rights Track was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 2 of the podcast is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. More information, including all the podcast episodes from Series 1 and accompanying show notes for each of our interviews, is available on our website at www.rightstrack.org.